one thing that I'm noticing is that you have so many different types of compositions. For example, you have this one here, which is of the animals, and it's this large quantity of animals all packed into one area. But you also have a piece like this, where the background is super active with so many little pieces. This one really becomes about the relationship, a conversation between the two skulls. This one has this stretching motion that goes off in a diagonal direction. So that is really terrific that your compositions are able to do so many different types of visuals. The other thing that I think is working well is that you do have very good distinction between different types of textures. So for example, in this portrait, this woman's hair feels very soft and silky, but then you've also captured the wrinkles in the skin. And then compared to that, the clothing feels quite fluid. And so that contrast within a single subject becomes very important in terms of making the subject more engaging. The things that I would consider working on, the first one would be balancing color saturation. Color saturation is basically how bright or how dull a color is. And so right now you have several black and white pieces, and that's fine. But in your color pieces, your tendency is to do either all bright colors or all dull colors. So for example, this one is largely all bright colors. There's some areas that are a little bit lighter, but that's more in terms of value, how light or dark something is. And then you also have a piece like this where, again, it's largely all really bright colors, this one as well. But then you have a piece like this, and also the one on the left, which is pretty much all muted colors. So I'm going to send you a slideshow in a stream where we talk about how you can balance the two together, because right now it almost feels like you're isolating them. It's either all muted or all bright, when really ideally you're going to want a blend of the two, because essentially the muted colors, even though they're sort of ugly, they're very important to have, because if you have too many bright saturated colors, then they actually don't look as bright. And so those muted colors are very important. And to be clear, that's not the same thing as value. So for example, in this piece, you're using very dark value in the background. That creates light and dark contrast, so that way the face pops, but that's not quite the same thing as color saturation. The other thing I'd like to see you do in terms of color is to be a lot more adventurous, because in a lot of circumstances, you really stick with the literal color of the subject matter. So for example, here, all of the animals, they're all what we expect these animals to be, which is darker browns and tan colors. Same thing if I look at this one, the flesh tone is pretty much limited to just these peach and brownish tones. And actually flesh tone is a place where you will see things like purple shadows or green shadows. Not obviously a super bright green, but something like an olive green is actually very common in a lot of flesh tones. And same thing with the clothing and the other materials as well. Like here we have the person with the red striped shirt, and it's pretty much limited to, okay, white and red. What happens if the lighting situation is very different? Like he's got this very bright yellow at the top. And so sometimes if you're, say, standing next to a light, sometimes a little bit of that warm yellow will actually reflect back onto the person. Now, it depends on what you're using. I get the feeling looking at a lot of these paintings that they are either out of your head, which I'm guessing would be this one, or this one, which very much looks like it's been done from a reference photo. Now, there's nothing wrong with drawing from a reference photo, but what I'd like to see you do is take a greater departure, because I think in this one, I really feel the photograph in the image. It feels like you're not really transforming the reference photo very much. You're more copying the reference photo. And so I would think about ways that stylistically you can change your use of that reference material to become less expected. The other thing that I think would really help you a lot would be to cut back on the number of really crisp, clear edges. So this one, for example, if I look at the contour of the neck and the head and even the hair as well, it's all very crisp and defined. Now, where it gets more interesting is, for example, the top of this eye up here, or actually this eye down here, I think is quite beautiful. And you can see in these three eyes that you have softer transitions where a gray sort of dissolves into the black. Now, if I look at a lot of your other pieces, those crisp edges tend to be everywhere. Same thing here. This one, I think, is a little problematic because the camel, it's so crisp and clear on the edges that it almost looks like somebody cut it out from a sheet of paper and glued it onto this pattern. Same thing with the skulls as well. So I would recommend going through and seeing if there's any edges that you can make a little bit softer. Like in this one, we have a very crisp edge, but I do really like how here the chin gets a lot softer. And so this creates a lot more depth. Whereas up here, it's just one continuous crisp line. And so we're not seeing that quite as well. And this one too, like the image with the animals, with the camel, again, looks like you cut her out and put her on a tan sheet of paper. Now, the other thing that I think would be good, because I know you were asking about that you wanted to add 2 new pieces and what materials and what subject. You had mentioned landscape and still life. I think what would be better would be for you to try to make an image that has a lot of space. Certainly landscape can be good for that, but oftentimes people associate landscape with trees and mountains, but it doesn't have to be that way. I mean, you could do an urban landscape. You could do one that is of a city that shows things going back to the distance. Because if I look at your paintings, pretty much all of them are one flat color in the background, like this one on the right, or if they are showing a space, like the image on the left, it's a very shallow space because we see the TV and the curtains, and I can imagine that the space between the child and the wall is actually quite shallow. Now, this one's a little bit better in that you have broken it up into shapes, but I don't really understand what kind of space you're trying to construct. And so I feel like there's sort of a mismatch between the figure and the background. The background's sort of abstract looking, but then the figure does have real life visuals. Like, for example, the shadow, which is up here, you've done modeling in terms of the anatomy, and that all seems like you are taking that from real life. And so it's almost like your background is in one language and your person is in another, and so they don't quite come together. I think it would be very good for you to try more different types of media, because as I look through this, you're pretty much doing acrylic painting, graphite, you've got some watercolor in there, but I also think in general, the paint, the way you're using it, it looks a lot more like acrylic. Like, I don't really see a watercolor language happening in a lot of these. I like that you're doing pastels. I don't know if this is oil pastel. It looks like it is to me, but one really cool combination, if you want to try mixed media, is to start out a painting in acrylic and then actually put oil pastels on top. That's sometimes a really fun combination because the acrylic paint tends to be smoother, but then the oil pastel has this like inherent gritty texture that you can put on top of it. So that would be a good thing for you to try in terms of mixed media, because I do feel like even though you're using different media, the look of the pieces is all pretty similar. So I'd like to see you do some more stylistic interpretations, so that way the pieces feel a little bit more different. In terms of mixed media, there's other things you can do. Like, since you use a lot of acrylic painting, it is really fun to add things to your acrylic paintings. For example, one of my staff actually puts old coffee grounds and mixes them into her acrylics. And that's especially helpful because that's a really distinct shift of media. Or sometimes people will like glue a sheet of fabric to a canvas and paint on top of that. So to really try to step outside of the painting techniques, because right now you're using them in a very similar manner. Now, I know you're doing oil paint, and that's fantastic. Oil painting is very challenging. I'm going to send you our intro to oil painting videos because it is a very complex painting material, and there's a lot of information that oftentimes people don't have when they're starting out. So I'm going to help you with that. And I'm not sure if this is on purpose, but I am noticing that your oil paintings all have that muddy dullness that I was talking about. And it does seem like the pieces that are in acrylic are very, very bright in terms of colors. So this may not be the case, but one of the biggest issues that people have with oil painting is trying to keep the colors from getting muddy. They just do that inherently. And so I'm hoping I can send you some technical information that will make that easier, because unlike acrylic, which dries quickly, acrylic, you don't tend to have that problem, but I think you're having it in the oil painting right now. Other things you can try, for example, trying an artwork which is not a rectangle. That is something which is more different. It's a bigger departure. And I think that's really what we want right now, is we want to see more different styles. Like this piece is very detailed, but how about doing a piece that's maybe a lot more gestural? Maybe the marks are a little bit looser and feel more expressive. I feel right now it's sort of a curse and a blessing, is that you are so good at detail, but it's sometimes a problem when you're putting it everywhere. It's important that those details, if you put them everywhere, they start to be not as interesting. And so oftentimes what you'll see in paintings, John Singer Sargent and Andrew Zorn would be examples of this. But if you look at their paintings, people will say, oh, wow, this John Singer Sargent portrait, it's so realistic. But if you look at it, sometimes the face will have details, but half the background is actually not really worked on that much. And so that's a way to create more of a focal point. Because here in the camel, if you want to say, oh, okay, the main thing I want people to look at here is the camel's head. Now, the other parts maybe are not as important. And so one thing you could do is you can add detail on the head, but maybe down here, make the camel less detailed. And so that shows more that you're not just default putting detail everywhere, but that you're actually being selective about where you place the detail. And that makes it a lot more intentional on your part. I also think whatever pieces you end up adding, I would not do the human figure, because right now, as I look through your portfolio, a lot of it is the human figure. So like I said, urban landscape or another landscape, I think it could be interesting for you to do something that is more fantastical. For example, one prompt that we have is an imaginary landscape. And that can be really great because you can really explore landscape, but not feel like you have to do something that's so traditional. And yet it's a really great exercise in terms of showing depth. So I'm going to send you something about atmospheric perspective, which is one of the fundamental things about creating a space. It should help you with creating something like that for your portfolio. Okay, let's go through and talk about the pieces individually. Okay, so this piece in graphite and acrylic, I think it has a lot of things going on. And while I really enjoy that it's such an active composition, I'm not totally sure where you want us to look. Because if we look at a face, just automatically, we just go straight to the eyes. That's just the way things are, okay? But you have eyes in the background as well. And actually in this piece, to me, the more interesting part of this piece is the eyes in the background. The eyes that are in the person, those are so outlined. I mean, they almost look like targets. And so it's hard for me to get into the eyes in the background because there's just so much emphasis on those. I also feel like even though the hair is beautiful and detailed, that it's taking attention away some more of the interesting parts. Like, for example, down here where you've broken up that upper part of the chest with these very fluid strokes, and then you have some of these going in the background. I feel like the whole, I would say 2/3 bottom of the piece is the most interesting. And so you might think about actually cropping this. For example, if you cropped off a big chunk of the hair at the top and trying to get a composition that's not quite so centered, This is sort of the quintessential default portrait pose that we see, which is, okay, put the head in the dead center, straight on, eye level. The other portrait that you have here is a lot better. This is more of a 3/4 view. We feel like she's got a little bit of tilt. It feels a lot more naturalistic. So actually, when you have people standing like this in a portrait, it looks very stiff. And so that's why I was thinking, maybe if we could take some emphasis off the face, brighten some of the eyes, get that going so we aren't just looking at the face, because I love the eyes in the back. They're very expressive and they say much more to me than the face, which is just more a straightforward rendering of a face. Okay, this is one of your weaker pieces in the portfolio. So I would either decide to spend a lot more time working on it or remove it from your portfolio entirely. I think a big part of it is that the background is so flat and so blank, but also I'm not totally sure why you have so much of it. Because if I look at the painting, that plain blue background is like 75% of your composition. And if you have an element like that, which is so dominant in a composition, it better be interesting, because otherwise all of the interest is in the bottom part of the piece. But then also with the animals, it's a little bit confusing because you have these characters, these animals at the top, and these are of course very clear cut. And I see you have a lot of animals down here, but I think the depth is getting really confusing. Like I'm having trouble figuring out which one's in front and which one's in back. It almost looks like a series of abstract shapes that are coming together. So if you decide to work on this more, one way to really push that depth is if you make the animals in the foreground a lot brighter, you make them more detailed, and then you do the opposite with the ones in the back. You make them more simple, more almost like silhouettes, and that will direct our attention to the ones in the foreground. I do think this one is probably worth just doing a new composition, because sometimes there's pieces where I really think it is worth working on them more. But this one, I think if you start from scratch and you think more deliberately about the depth and the composition, you're probably going to be better off. This is also one where I think I'm craving seeing more tactile texture, because animals have that. And these animals, they look too smooth. And so I would say just don't be afraid to really embrace the textures and maybe even make them more dramatic than they actually are. This piece, I think, has trouble with its focal point, as I mentioned earlier, because everything is so detailed that really makes it hard for us to figure out where we're supposed to look. And I think it's a couple things. I think it's the detail that's all over the camel, but also the background is super busy. Now, you probably could get away with that if, for example, your subject matter was really simple and not very detailed, but it is detailed and it's not simple. And so I would just think about when you are planning out these compositions that you really think about creating areas of rest for the eye. So for example, here you have these shapes and they're everywhere in the entire background. Now, if you had, let's say, one area up here where the dots were, let's say, really low in contrast. So maybe the dots in this section, they're still there, but maybe the background is like a very dark blue. And so you don't see the shapes as visibly. So that's an area for your eye to rest. Because if you have too many areas and they're all sort of screaming for our attention, that makes it very difficult to follow as a viewer. And if you think about it sort of like a movie, like if you have a scene and there's 80 characters and they all are standing in the same place and they're all detailed and wearing the same thing, watching that movie clip, it's like we're so overwhelmed, like we have no idea where to look at. So oftentimes one element that you'll see a lot of movies do is they'll use lighting to point and direct you to look at something specific. And so that's what you could be doing here that I think would be helpful. But also try to really imagine this animal in the space, because what's happening in the background, it feels like wallpaper and it feels like the camel's just stuck there. So this is, again, where I really think about the background and the place that you want to put these animals in, because I think here is just so separated that it almost feels like it's like two different paintings have been put on top of each other and they don't have a lot of relationship beyond that. Okay, this piece I think has some potential in terms of the way you have the skulls breaking up. I do think the one on the right is more interesting because that point of view is very unusual. Like, that's not a point of view that you typically see. Usually in a skull, people are looking at it straight on. The one on the left is sort of typical. It's that side view of the skull. People are used to seeing that. The one on the right is really dynamic because not only is it tilted, but we're also looking up. And so that's one of the things I really like about the skull on the right is it just has so much more dimension, the way that it's interacting in the space. That said, though, I do think that the composition really sort of splits down the middle. And so I don't know if you're willing to work on this piece more, but I think it'd be very interesting if you added more skulls. And obviously you put a lot of graphite back there, but I don't even think the skulls need to be that dramatically bright because these two are the main event. But I do think if you added some skulls in the background that were sort of dark, but still present, and having them go off the page, that would make this more dynamic, because that's the other thing about this composition is not only is it straight down the middle, but you also have two objects that are fully contained in the center of the composition. And so what that ends up doing is it sort of isolates your subject. And I want to find a reason, a way for you to make the edges and the corners of the piece interesting. Give me a reason for my eye to go up into that corner and do something else. And so that's another compositional element that you can try in some of your pieces, is letting things go off the page. I think here where they're very contained, we see everything. I think definitely that gets a little bit flat. Same thing with edges up here, very crisp edges. If you just go in there with your finger or a eraser, you can easily smudge down some of those areas. So that way those edges aren't so graphic. The other thing too, is I see you have the skulls like they're almost breaking up and disintegrating. So I think that's a fine idea, but I would love to see you push that further. And again, this is another situation where you could work on this some more. For example, right now you have the chin and it's got a couple pieces falling off. But what would it look like if the whole jaw was just completely obliterated? What would happen if on this skull, it's breaking apart in two different parts? Let's say, okay, it's breaking up here, but let's say these teeth are falling down or something like that. So this is a good idea as a beginning, but I think as a composition, it feels pretty unresolved. So I don't know if you have experience doing thumbnail sketches, but thumbnails are really helpful when you're trying to work out your composition and doing it quickly on a small scale. Because typically speaking, what happens is people get to this stage, they've worked on the piece for a really long time, but they have fundamental things about the composition that are difficult to fix. So for example, right now, if I said to you, oh, you need to move this skull up 3 inches, that just feels impossible because you've spent so much time and labor on this. And you clearly have a very strong work ethic. But if you have that resolve, you've got a stronger composition, things are more dynamic, and you have that all planned out before you start the composition, number one, it's going to get you a better composition. And number two, you're going to really be able to just spend your time on the drawing. If you're thinking about composition or moving things around at this stage, it just gets really confusing. This piece, I don't think, is one of your better pieces. I think because it's a very commonly seen image, especially in movies. I don't know that this is necessarily the movie that you were referencing, but I think ever since we had that scene of Keanu Reeves in The Matrix and his mouth was glued shut and it was doing stuff like this, I think all these other movies started doing that as well. And so this is one of those images that I think because of that film has become a very big cliche. So what I would recommend, it's not to say you can't use this piece. I mean, it's well rendered, but I think the imagery is not dramatic enough. For example, if you're talking about skin, something elastic and something gooey and goopy like glue, you probably would want things to look like that. But the thing is here, the way you've done the glue part, that actually looks really rigid. It almost looks like plastic, which has been cut, but is rigid. And so I think if you want to keep this piece, I would go back in and make it really stretchy, make it messy. Right now, it looks so clean. For example, what if that lower lip gets pulled outwards? What if some of the hair is like hanging off the right-hand side? I think that would make it more dramatic. And I also try to figure out what this board is, because it's very different if it's just some random sheet of gray than if you say, oh, actually, this is the back of a book, or maybe this is the back of a vacuum. I don't know. I'm just coming up with different things. But usually if you can be more specific like that, that is helpful. I guess the thing is about this piece is that the most exciting part of this composition, which is the glue part, is actually the least developed. I feel like you spent a lot of time on the hair, also on the clothing over here, but you have to keep in mind, oh, the real drama here is in the glue. So I would just try to make sure whenever you're working on things that you make sure that your priorities are aligned with the composition and what it is that the piece is trying to say. This, I think, is one of your weaker pieces. I think I would probably redo this one. I would also be careful, similar to the first image we looked at, would be eyes. Eyes are very cliche. People do them all the time. And so I would ask yourself, okay, why am I adding all these eyes? What's the reason? Because right now it feels sort of random and it doesn't quite match, because these people have 2 eyes. This person has 2, but then we have this like one random eye. And it's confusing because I don't know if it's supposed to be in front of this big face, if it's attached to the big face. I sort of think it is. But again, here's with the depth. Showing what is really truly in front of something else would help. But this piece, I think, needs a lot of work. And I do think that it would be helpful for you to use some reference images, because your other anatomical stuff is pretty accurate, maybe even too accurate. But here, when you just throw it all out the window, you're not left with a lot. So I'm not saying you got to make this anatomically correct. Obviously, that's not the point of this piece. But to look at some specifics, like I think the ear here is verging on looking like a butterfly wing. So doing things like that to get that going. This piece, amazing technique. I know you probably work so long and hard about this piece. My favorite part is definitely the mouth. I think the mouth, you got this wonderful glistening highlight on there. I love the way you did the skin wrinkles. The neck is also really nicely done. So those areas are very good. Now, I would think about these birds, because the thing is, you've shown us how great and strong your technique is. And so the consequence of that is, if you don't do that same thing in the other parts of the piece, this area with the birds, to me, really drags it down, because the technique in painting the birds, I mean, this really looks unfinished compared to everything else. Everything else you've worked on so hard, but here, this almost feels like an afterthought. The other thing I would also be aware of is birds flying out of people's heads, another cliche that we see very often. So I'm going to send you a video that talks about cliches. So think about other things this could be. You can do birds, it's not saying you can't, but you're going to have to work a little harder to make it not fall into that cliche. I mean, I think one thing that would help is just to do way more of them. Have them going off the page, have a really big one, make them more dramatic. That would definitely make a big difference. This piece, I think, is interesting because of the subtle color scheme, which I do like. I think it does show the mixtures, but I think it goes back to that background. And this one, I think you really could do the background again, because the figure is quite strong. I think it's one of your more expressive figures, but definitely creating a place for him. Like even down here on the foot, it seems like maybe you had a reference photo and maybe the person's foot was like in a sofa or something soft like that. But the thing is, when the surface he's sitting on is just plain flat white all the way through, we don't see that interaction. And so if we felt his weight like pressing into a sofa, then we would believe he was in the space more. Okay, the piece on the right, I don't think that's one of your stronger pieces. I think it's confusing what I'm looking at. I'm not sure if the yellow is supposed to be something glowing or if it's meant to be more like a pattern or design, and the lines that are going through the head. I mean, it's almost like the top part from the neck and above is one painting and the bottom part is another. So I think it's a piece that doesn't quite know exactly what it's trying to do. And so you have these sort of mismatched styles. The one on the left, I think you could work on. I do think you need to really resolve what's happening at the bottom down here. I think this is getting very mushy. And it seems like it's something sort of similar because you have these horizontal lines as well. I don't know if these are supposed to be separate pieces. I think they are. But I think this concept of the horizontality is not helping you right now. I think I'm more interested in this one with the television, the curtain, the kid, the fish. Those are the more interesting elements right now. So certainly you can go back and work on these. But again, it may actually be more efficient for you to think through some of the compositional elements that I was talking about and about depth and about color. It might actually be faster. I'm also seeing these are sort of on the small side. So certainly if that helps you with time, that can be a good thing. But you've got a pretty significant amount of pieces. I think that this is a great supplement to your application, even though you're not going to art school. I think certainly one of a very effective way to distinguish yourself, as most people don't have an art portfolio who are going to liberal arts or university. But I think that the main thing is for you to really start to expand your vocabulary, how you use the paint, different mixed media, really pushing those backgrounds would be very, very helpful. And I think that that will really steer you in the right direction in terms of making new pieces or perhaps working on some of these